Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to respond to that very warm and largely untrue introduction and to hope that the realization of the truth will not be too depressing. Before beginning my lecture, however, I would like to extend, if I may, a brief welcome on behalf of Acadia University to those who have come as delegates to the Baptist Heritage Conference. The university is very pleased to be associated with the Divinity College in this conference, which, as Andrew said, is the first major event after our weekend activities to inaugurate the 150th anniversary celebrations. Some thanks, I believe, are in order. I would like to thank the Planning Committee for their invitation to deliver the first 1987 Hayward lecture, and observe that their kindness in asking me is exceeded only by their rashness in renewing the invitation, which initially I declined. I would like to thank the university archivist and her colleagues, whose efficiency in tracking down information is exceeded only by their desire to help aspiring researchers who frequently are not quite sure what it is that they seek. I would thank the Vice Presidents, whose patience and support for my work connected with this lecture is exceeded only by their relief that it is now finished and their hopes that the President may now begin again to write letters and attend meetings. I would also thank the two Executive Secretaries who work in the office of the President and whose efficiency and industry is exceeded only by their charm and tolerance of presidential peculiarities. Last of all, I would express my thanks to Dr. Herbert Lewis of the Department of Philosophy. Some years ago, when I began detailed research on Watson Kirkconnell's verse translations, I found that I could not obtain a copy of a very important volume, European Elegies. And Dr. Lewis, as those who know him will be acutely aware, is deeply attached to all the volumes in his extensive library. However, he gave me his copy, which I have regularly used ever since. And so to our topic, there were giants in the earth in those days. In the early hours of the 16th of July, 1925, two young men were sleeping fitfully just inside the main door of the Ross Memorial Hospital in Lindsay, Ontario. The hospital staff had thoughtfully provided two small cots so that the men could rest. But their anxiety was such that proper sleep was impossible. One of them was a professor from Wesley College, Winnipeg, where he taught English. He had returned to his native region for a holiday. About noon on the previous day, his wife, the former Isabel Peel, had given birth to twin boys. The babies were fairly healthy, but she had gradually weakened during the afternoon and by evening was critically ill. The other young man was a friend of the professor and a son of the physician who was battling to save the young mother's life. At about 4 a.m., the young men were suddenly brought to full consciousness by a loud knocking on the door only a few feet from where they lay. They leapt up and rushed to the door, eager to help in whatever emergency situation had arisen. But when they opened the door, there was no one there, and no sound except that of the torrential summer rain beating on the ground. The two men stood in shocked silence, and as they did so, they heard footsteps behind them. They turned to see a nurse who beckoned to the husband. He hurried with her to the bedside of his wife, who passed away within a few minutes of his arrival. The young professor was Watson Kirkconnell. Born in Port Hope in 1895, a graduate of Queen's University in Classics in 1916, a veteran of the Canadian Army in the Department of Internment Operations. His indifferent health prevented him from serving overseas or in a combat unit. The first IODE scholar from Ontario. He studied for the B.Lit degree in economics at Lincoln College, Oxford, from 1921 to 22. the author of a book entitled The International Aspects of Unemployment, and a teacher with a growing reputation for thoroughness and high standards. The loss of his wife shattered several aspects of the life Kirkconnell had been building since joining the faculty of Wesley College in the fall of 1922. It destroyed the almost idyllic home life he had enjoyed with Isabel Peel for one short year. It constituted the first serious test of the faith he had hitherto accepted as part of his thinking and outlook, and it drove him to seek occupation for his mind and solace for his spirit in one of the most ambitious literary projects ever attempted by an individual. He decided, as a memorial to his wife, to translate into English verse all the elegies he could find in European languages, both ancient and modern. 40 years later, he was to describe the project thus: books were secured from all over Europe, and through winter nights that might otherwise have seemed interminable, I poured my grief and my linguistic zeal into the task. Incredible as it may seem, by April 1926, less than a year later, the work was almost complete, and a manuscript containing translations of elegies from no less than 40 languages, as different as Latin, German, Portuguese, Polish, Welsh, Finnish and Icelandic, was ready for the presses of some adventurous publisher. The collection contained Clouds of Silver, translated from the Finnish. Clouds of silver, ride and race and soar on beyond the blue horizon and return no more. Fair they flash and gleam and glitter, laughing in the light, and behind far golden portals vanish from the sight. So bright days of perfect pleasure pass and disappear, leaving the cold hail of sorrow to its task austere. Kirkconnell's rendering of a Romany folk song from Hungary was entitled Morning. Everywhere I pass today, cold rocks wall my wretched way. Down the granite wastes a wing, winter winds have slain the spring, as my frosts of grief have done, marring May when scarce begun. Nor can showers of my weeping rouse that dead joy from its sleeping. Could I be the grave's dark guest, I would gladly take my rest. The last poem in the collection, translated from the Swedish and called A Man's Last Word to a Woman, summarizes Kirkconnell's grief in a mere 6 lines. I followed, flushed with hope, thy path of roses, in springtime's radiant dawn and showery stress. The record of our summer love discloses noontides of passion past all power of guess. And in the autumn gloom, when the act closes, I give thee thanks, who wert my happiness. Now, despite the industry and achievement apparent in the poetry, serious obstacles were in the path of its publication. On the 3rd of April, 1926, Kirkconnell wrote to Messrs. George, Allen and Unwin, the British firm which had published International Aspects of Unemployment, offering them the translation under the title A European Book of Elegy, subtitled A Collection of 100 Poems, predominantly elegiac in tone, chosen and translated by myself from some 40 different languages, past and present. The letter that he sent to the publisher, or the projected publisher, included the statements: so far as I am aware, no work of translation on so catholic a scale has ever been attempted in any country. The nature of the selections, too, is such that the work might appeal to the general public as well as to the scholar. I should be grateful if you would, in stating your attitude towards such a volume, give me at the same time your candid advice on one point. Would you think it desirable to print throughout on opposite pages to the translations the original, of the 40 languages. Reflecting on this letter almost 40 years later, Kirkconnell would see it in perspective and was able to write, "Such a letter, from a man known to them only as the author of a successful volume in economics, apparently gave Alan and Unwin justifiable doubts as to my sanity." Certainly, the response was unequivocal. The managing editor of the press, a Mr. Skinner, replied on the 14th of April 26 as follows: "Dear Sir, we thank you for your letter of April the 3rd and enclosures. While we shall be very willing to consider the complete manuscript of your European Book of Elegy when ready, we very much doubt whether we shall see our way to make a proposal for its publication. As you ask for our candid advice, we will say quite frankly that we think you have undertaken too big a task. We do not believe that there is any living man so intimately acquainted with 40 different European languages, past and present, as to be able to translate poems from those languages. Yours sincerely." Kirkconnell was still emotionally vulnerable from his bereavement and intellectually exhausted from the phenomenal labours of the previous months. Whereas other people in similar circumstances might have given up the publication project, he became the more determined to carry it through. It was as though his grief required that his translations appear in print, and his intellectual integrity required that the accuracy of his work be certified by scholars of unquestioned reputation. So he sent copies of the selections of the original poems and the translations to the scholars most likely to be able to determine the quality of his work. And without exception, the responses were positive. Despite this recognition, much work remained to be done. The copyright for each poem had to be obtained, and a publisher found who was willing to take the commercial risk involved in printing such a volume. Eventually, the Graphic Publishers of Ottawa, a firm which prided itself on the production of Canadian books of consequence, agreed to print the translations, although not the original poems, along with brief notes on the poets and an introductory essay on verse translation. And in 1928, the volume appeared with the title European Elegies, 100 poems chosen and translated from European literatures in 50 languages. It was a book of 166 pages, clearly printed and well bound. And here, by courtesy of Dr. Herbert Lewis and with Ron Baxter, I thought he was trying to steal it by covering it up, but he didn't. That is European Elegies. Critical response to European Elegies was swift and positive. The Kirkconnell papers include scores of letters written in dozens of languages expressing appreciation of the beauty of the translations and the incredulity at the linguistic achievement they represent. One point frequently made was that the poems do not read at all like translations, but might stand as poetic creations in their own right. On the 18th of August 1928, the Montreal Star began its review thus: "No more remarkable book than Professor Watson Kirkconnell's European Elegies, the Graphic Publishers, has ever appeared in Canada." An Icelandic review, published in Reykjavik, included the comment, "One thing is certain. Since Tennyson achieved In Memoriam, this book is the most glorious wreath that any man has laid at the grave of the beloved dead." Such a fascinating story surely ought to conclude with a comment that the book established Kirkconnell's fame and fortune. It certainly established his fame, and the literary world was well aware that there was a new star in the linguistic firmament. But there was no fortune. The Graphic Publishers subsequently went bankrupt, and the accountant responsible for winding up their estate wrote to Kirkconnell acknowledging that he should have received a royalty check for $744, but enclosing a proportional payment in the form of a check for $2.05. Now, this story has been told at some length because I believe that it is the clue to an understanding of what I suggest is Kirkconnell's single most important contribution to Canadian society and higher education. A project which began as a solace for personal grief introduced him to the elegiac literature of many nations. Immigrants from several of these nations had come to Canada and had settled on the prairies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with a major influx immediately following the First World War. These immigrants had tended to stay in national groups, so that the Ukrainians would settle in one area, the Hungarians in another, and so on. Once the battle for simple survival was over, churches were built and conscious efforts were made to maintain ethnic heritages by educational, religious, and cultural societies. Newspapers began to appear, keeping alive the languages, publishing articles and poems, providing valuable information to farmers and families, and giving a sense of identity to local communities. Almost alone among the Canadians of his day, Kirkconnell was able to become both an observer of and a participant in this process. Inevitably, his interest in the immigrant literature brought him into contact with the authors and their families. In later years, when the children of immigrants sought admission to universities, it was to Kirkconnell that parents turned for information and advice. And his counsel invariably had double motivation: to enable the young people to achieve their full potential and to contribute to the maximum in Canadian society, and to encourage them to know and respect the ethnic inheritance that was theirs. I would therefore summarize the first major contribution made by Kirkconnell to Canadian society and higher education by saying that he was the father of multiculturalism in this country. And in saying this, I am assuming that by multiculturalism we mean an awareness of and a sensitivity to the life, work, and letters of immigrant groups, and a willingness to defend the rights of those groups within the larger Canadian context. It is at this point that I believe that we see the influence of the Baptist upbringing which shaped much of Kirkconnell's thinking about what today we would call human rights and equality of opportunity. He had been brought up in what one might regard as a classical Baptist tradition, characterized by a high regard for education, a love of personal freedom, and a readiness to defend the rights of others, particularly those who were part of a disadvantaged group. These attitudes, blended with his insatiable intellectual curiosity and enormous capacity for sustained industry, partially explain Kirkconnell's concern for immigrant people and his ability to express that concern in practical and effective ways. In short, it was his blend of emotional experience, intellectual capacity, and spiritual inheritance which led him to attempt and achieve objectives which justify our speaking of him as the father of Canadian multiculturalism. In 1934, the Canadian Polish Society was formed in Winnipeg, and Kirkconnell became its first president, the first of many similar offices he was to hold. In 1938, he and Hope, whom he had married in 1930, visited Hungary, where Watson lectured at the summer school in the University of Debrecen. Such contacts as this increased his awareness of the culture which had been brought to Canada by the immigrants and made him the more determined that it should not be lost. Throughout his 18 years in Winnipeg, Kirkconnell was constantly building up his library of dictionaries and grammars and tracked down and registered in his files the names of authors and poets who wrote in the immigrant languages, as well as noting and collecting copies of scores of ethnic magazines, newspapers and journals which had been published, many of them lasting only for a very short time. Due to his industry, this information was secured and documented. But for him, much of the early material would have disappeared without trace. One result of Kirkconnell's interest and industry in relation to immigrant poets was the publication in 1935 of Canadian Overtones, a little book of just over 100 pages with a descriptive subtitle, an anthology of Canadian poetry, written originally in Icelandic, Swedish, Norwegian, Hungarian, Italian, Greek and Ukrainian, and now translated and edited with biographical, historical, critical and bibliographical notes. 43 different poets are represented, and they describe the whole range of immigrant life. Sigbjørn Johansen, 1839 to 1903, came to Canada from Iceland in 1889 and encountered extreme hardship, reflected in his brief poem, Emigration to Canada. I never knew what dearth's grim hand to starving mortals meant, until from out my native land it gave me banishment. With half my lifetime thrown away, in exile I must toil, and rest, when ends my human day, in this cold, alien soil. By contrast, Sten Victor Gerwel, who came to Canada from Sweden in 1920, was optimistic about his future. Soon after his arrival, he wrote a 4-stanza poem entitled 15 Cents in My Pocket. The last verse runs, 15 cents in my pocket, merriment in my heart, a loving maid in remembrance, grief is a world apart. Soon shall the joys of Yuletide echo the wide world through, soon shall the peace of Christmas sit at my table too. Kirkconnell's preface to the book states, this book seeks to reveal to English-speaking Canadians a transient but intensely significant phase of our national literature. The poems translated were all written during the first 35 years of the century and constitute a major literary step in the development of multiculturalism. Kirkconnell himself suggested that it should help to develop in succeeding generations a Canadianism nourished by pride in the individual's past. He closed his preface with these words, it is the modest purpose of this present volume, by revealing to English-speaking Canada that these cultural traditions have already had vital expression in Canadian poetry, to press for a wider conception of national life and national literature. Now, one result of the publication of Canadian Overtones was an invitation from A.S.P. Woodhouse to contribute an annual review of New Canadian Letters to the University of Toronto Quarterly. So, beginning in 1937, Kirkconnell reviewed an average of 70 books a year for the Quarterly, giving up this demanding task in 1966, after 29 years of continuous reviewing activity. In 1940, the federal government formed a nationalities branch, forerunner of the Canadian Citizenship Bureau, and asked Kirkconnell to assist in its organization. He was later offered the position of director of the branch, but declined the invitation. He gave as the reason for his rejection of the offer the academic responsibilities he had just accepted as head of the Department of English at McMaster University. But the deeper reason, not voiced at the time, was that an appointment in the public service would limit his freedom of speech. In his words, I foresaw that I could probably guard the rights and welfare of new Canadians much better as a free agent. In 1941, the Director of Public Information in Ottawa issued under the authority of the Minister of National War Services a 48-page illustrated booklet by Kirkconnell entitled Canadians All, a primer of Canadian national unity. In the foreword, the Director of Public Information states, in this booklet, the authoritative pen of Professor Watson Kirkconnell tells the story of the peoples of Canada and points to a road for us to follow towards permanent unification of all our groups into one strong, resolute nation. Despite Kirkconnell's tremendously varied achievements, I would repeat the assertion made earlier that the contribution to Canadian society and higher education which takes pride of place is his role as the father of multiculturalism. This is how one of his outstanding pupils, C.H. Andrusician, put it in 1975. Dr. Kirkconnell was the foremost Canadian who in the 30s of the present century succeeded in effecting the beginnings of mutual concord between his own national kind and those who sought refuge in Canada from the miseries they suffered in Central and Eastern Europe. And in his autobiography, A Slice of Canada, published in 1967, Dr. Kirkconnell himself wrote, "Perhaps the one thing for which I shall be remembered a century hence will be that single-handed I discovered, surveyed, and recorded in Canada's cultural registry of deeds this diverse collectivity of literary achievement, revealing as it does a major factor in the life of the New World." In 1936, Watson Kirkconnell, at the early age of 41, became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His name had not been listed on the ballots, but the Fellows elected him by a write-in, thus underlining the scholarly eminence he had achieved during his years in Winnipeg. The Royal Society was to be the vehicle through which he made what I would judge to be his second major contribution to Canadian society and higher education. You will be relieved to know that the second and third parts are rather briefer than the first. The year 1942 was a dark one for the Allied nations involved in the Second World War. As yet, there had been no significant victories to lighten the gloom. The Japanese attack on the American fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had brought the United States into the war, but it was to be many months before the tide would turn against Germany and Japan. In Canada, the war was having a positive effect on the economy, providing new jobs and increasing demands for war material of many kinds. However, it was also having a negative effect on the lives of many people as the casualty lists lengthened, particularly of those involved in aerial warfare or the transporting of war material from Canada to Britain. The desire to promote the Allied cause and increase the war effort produced many curious side effects. But none was stranger than the proposal advanced in the fall of 1942 to close the faculties of arts, commerce, education and law in all Canadian universities until the end of hostilities. There was some evidence that public opinion might support such closures, and it was rumoured that Prime Minister Mackenzie King was prepared to approve it. There was near panic among the humanities professoriate, who felt the more vulnerable when they realised that certain other disciplines had come together in 1940 to form the Canadian Social Sciences Research Council, a body which was able to mount an effective lobby at the federal level. It was Kirkconnell and some of his colleagues from Section 2 of the Royal Society, that deals with humanities and social sciences, who took up the matter on behalf of the threatened humanities departments. A small group met at Kirkconnell's home in Hamilton to discuss strategy. They prepared a draft document which Kirkconnell then sent to heads of humanities departments and certain university presidents. Comments and proposals for amendments were invited, and a revised document was prepared and sent to the Prime Minister late in 1942. The statement was a comprehensive one and informed the Prime Minister that already almost all the students in honours and graduate courses in departments of English, classics, modern languages and philosophy were women, or men, and I quote, who are ineligible through youth or infirmity for military service. The memorial went on, we recognize that the manpower needs of the nation at war are of paramount validity, and that no fit student of draft age has any inherent right to exemption. The document argued the case for maintaining viable humanities departments, both in terms of planning for the future and even in meeting wartime needs. It records the charming view: art students have proved to be excellent officer material and are often better equipped to handle problems of personnel than are technically trained men. But the main thrust of the document was not the importance of the humanities in wartime, but their intrinsic value as a component in post-war education. Again I quote, "If the civilized values of the race are to survive, we shall need to have at least a fair number of men in our communities who have a strong grasp of principles and whose minds, while appreciating practical details, can rise above these details to a sense of broad human significance." Well, by the spring of 1943 it became clear that the proposed closures would not take place. But, in Kirkconnell's words, all in all, scholars of Canada had had a bad scare. And the Royal Society decided, when it met in May in Hamilton, to appoint a committee to consider the desirability of organizing a Humanities Research Council in Canada. Kirkconnell was appointed chairman, and Milton Buchanan and Arthur Woodhouse, both from the University of Toronto, became members. The former was described by Kirkconnell as the scholarly, well-groomed and somewhat pessimistic professor of Spanish, and the latter as a double for Dr. Samuel Johnson in bulk, forthrightness and intellectual gusto. Kirkconnell was asked to draft a constitution and a statement of aims, and an organisational meeting took place in Hart House, University of Toronto, on the 29th of December in 1943. On that historic occasion, the Humanities Research Council of Canada was formed. A 16-member council was selected and a 5-member executive chosen. Kirkconnell was appointed as chairman of the council. The executive committee quickly began work to form 2 committees to deal with grants for scholars, one dealing with research, the other with publications. This was fine, except that there was no money to disperse for either purpose, and the small resources that were available for the new council were provided by the Canadian Social Sciences Research Council. Kirkconnell then led a delegation to the United States, partly to obtain information on how grants for research and publication in the humanities were handled in that country, and partly to solicit from the Rockefeller Foundation funds for the J.R.C. The attempt to secure funds was unsuccessful, and the Canadians then visited the secretary of the Carnegie Corporation. Kirkconnell's description of this visit is worth repetition. The visitors received from Dr. Lester, and I quote, "only a genial lecture on the sad fate, in his opinion, of all foundation-supported organizations. They begin," he explained, "with a paid secretary, then added a stenographer and an office, and then the expense of a periodical of some sort. The secretary next acquired a wife and a baby. No other sources of support were sought out, and when, after 5 years or 10, the Carnegie Corporation withdrew its grant, the organization folded up, and 4 unhappy people found themselves on the street. He was unwilling to cause all this grief to 4 innocent Canadians, and dismissed us with urbane cheerfulness." Kirkconnell was stung by this somewhat gloomy prognosis and resolved that it should not so happen in Canada. He wrote to the Rockefeller Foundation asking for money to finance a thorough survey of the humanities in Canada and to run the new council for 2 years while the survey took place. The letter brought results to the extent of a grant of $8,000 for the stated purposes. The survey was extensive and thorough. The country was divided into 3 regions: Western Canada, Ontario, and the East. The Francophone institutions were treated as a 4th group, regardless of their location. 5 sets of questionnaires were prepared and distributed. They were sent to university and college presidents, deans or registrars, heads of department, librarians, and each faculty member in the humanities. Visits were then made to each institution, after which sections of the report were drafted by individuals or small groups, reviewed in detail by the whole council, and then sent in the fall of 1946 to a very large number of individual administrators and scholars. Reactions and comments were received and studied, then reviewed by the full council, and a final text agreed. In 1947, the report appeared in book form. It was a substantial volume of 209 pages, plus 78 pages of appendices. Under the title The Humanities in Canada, the book sold for the surprisingly low price, I grieve with the university librarian over this one, of $2. The chapter entitled Immediate Recommendations was 7 pages long and written by Kirkconnell. The whole process had been a complex and at times tedious one, and he had borne the major responsibility in connection with publication. 30 years later, he commented, "I was never more thankful to see the end of a book." The survey and publication of the report had an interesting and important sequel. Almost all the universities made donations to the new council, a point noted with appreciation by the American foundations which received copies of the Humanities in Canada. The contribution of money by institutions, most of which were in difficult financial circumstances, indicated that they were serious about the maintenance and development of studies in the humanities. For the next 11 years, the Rockefeller Foundation provided the Humanities Research Council of Canada with a total of $115,000, and the Carnegie Foundation, now apparently convinced that no wives and babies would eventually be deprived because of its initial generosity, donated $80,000. Thus, the Humanities Research Council of Canada came into being as an organization with clear objectives, possessed of an extensive bank of relevant information, and led by the outstanding literary, linguistic, and philosophical figures of the day. These characteristics were of immense value in the immediate post-war years. In 1977, Parliament passed the legislation which created the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. In order to avoid confusion with the newly created body, the Humanities Research Council of Canada, that's the one we were talking about a moment ago, changed its name to the Canadian Federation for the Humanities. In 1983, the CFH published a very brief history of its activities and provided information concerning the creation of its parent, the Humanities Research Council of Canada. It is appropriate that the name of Watson Kirkconnell occurs in the very first line of the history, and that his name, along with that of A.S.P. Woodhouse, frequently occurs in the early part of the document. The history provides a brief but perceptive comment on the volume which resulted from the extensive inquiries undertaken by Kirkconnell and his colleagues. I have the quotation, I will not read it at this time. Kirkconnell's contribution to the formation of the Humanities Research Council of Canada was a significant one, but at the time it was not possible to see its full implication. The Council came into being as a result of a wartime suggestion that departments of humanities be closed. During the 1950s, there was a sudden shift of emphasis towards scientific learning, and the existence and work of the H.R.C. was a steadying influence. Kirkconnell himself once wrote, Machinery is not an inevitable cause for satisfaction. If it becomes a mere end in itself, it can be a menace to intellectual and spiritual growth. It is my own feeling, however, that all this organization of the humanities, for which a few of us laid the foundations in 1942 to 47, has had a profound influence on these disciplines in Canada, and that its greatest achievements are still to come. Few will wish to dispute any part of that statement. Kirkconnell's first major contribution made to Canadian society and higher education was made when he was a young, grief-stricken professor at Wesley College in Winnipeg. The second, in my judgment, was made when he was an established teacher and researcher at McMaster University in Hamilton. His third contribution was made when he was president of Acadia University in Wolfville and relates to the matter of financial support by the provincial government for the universities in Nova Scotia. When Kirkconnell was appointed as the 9th president of Acadia in 1948, he quickly discovered that one of his major problems was money, or rather lack of it. In 1946, the return of the veterans of World War II had swelled enrollments to an all-time high of 930. In 1948, there were 818 registrants. Then numbers steadily declined to a low of 480 in 1951. In 1948, the faculty salary scale was the lowest in Canada. As the last ex-servicemen passed through the university, so the revenues supplied by the Department of Veterans Affairs ceased. In terms of raising replacement income, Kirkconnell was at a disadvantage. He was not a maritimer, had no base of acquaintances in the churches, and did not like fundraising, although he was willing to do, out of a sense of duty, what he would not have done by choice. There was a special kind of frustration arising from the fact that the Baptist Convention, I speak of the corporate body, controlled the university from the legal and administrative point of view, but provided less than 1% of its income, a state of affairs that necessitated a great deal of direct contact with individual donors and the churches. Kirkconnell quickly recognized that a new source of substantial funding had to be found. He believed that Nova Scotians would increasingly recognize the importance of a university education, resulting in increased enrollments, but that student fees alone could never generate enough money to effect the many changes he wished to see at Acadia. His solution to the problem lay with the provincial government. He was convinced that at least some of the costs of university education should be borne by the taxpayer. He also understood that only a joint approach from all the institutions was likely to get a sympathetic hearing from the government. As a result of a great deal of diplomacy and quiet insistence, Kirkconnell persuaded the university presidents to move away from the intense rivalries and competition which normally prevailed, to cooperate in a submission to the provincial government. He wrote the first draft of the document to be presented and led the delegation of 6 other presidents to meet with the cabinet. The result was highly significant for the future of Nova Scotia universities on 2 counts. First, a government grant of $250,000 was approved for the institutions for the fiscal year 1958-59. Second, a formula was provided for the division of the money. The formula, incidentally, was that each full-time non-theological student in the second or subsequent year of study counted as 1 unit. Candidates for the MA, MSc and PhD degrees counted for 3 units. The allocation was to be made on the basis of weighted enrollment statistics. Kirkconnell recorded his modified rapture at the receipt of this grant in these words: "The help was enthusiastically received, yet in the light of exploding registrations and exploding costs, the grant was only 1 lamb chop to 7 starving tigers." When the President went back 2 years later to Premier Robert Stanfield, he decided to appoint a University Grants Commission to conduct a comprehensive study of the funding of higher education in Nova Scotia. But the key precedent had already been established, that the province's universities, most of them theoretically church-controlled but certainly not church-funded, were legitimate charges on the public purse. Kirkconnell was due to retire in the summer of 1964, soon after his 69th birthday. In February of that year, he suffered a serious heart attack and was forced to endure 3 weeks of total immobility in the Eastern King's Memorial Hospital in Wolfville under the care of Dr. Douglas Denton, the consultant cardiologist, whose anecdotes I will not repeat here. Within 2 months of the attack, he was back at work, preparing to leave office and writing a speech he was to deliver at St. Mary's University in Halifax on the 4th of May, when he was to receive the degree of Doctor of Civil Law honoris causa. It is obvious that Kirkconnell had grown increasingly concerned over the financial situation of Acadia during the previous 10 years and had decided to make his last major public speech as president a challenge to the provincial government. Parts of the speech contain sentiments and phrases ideally suited for use in the public press. The speech began with a slightly self-derogatory image. When a tired old racehorse is just about ready to be turned out to pasture, men may pat him on the nose, braid ribbons in his mane, feed him a few lumps of sugar, and tell him what a good runner he used to be. But the real theme of the speech quickly emerged and may be summed up in a single short sentence: the universities are underfunded. By this time, the young people whose birth had been termed the post-war baby boom were entering university, and there were simply not enough resources to meet the need. The annual grant of $250,000 was gratefully acknowledged, but the lamb chop to starving tiger image was evoked again to underline the inadequacy of the amount. After deploring the high student fees and the low professorial salaries, Kirkconnell launched into a paragraph destined to provide newsworthy copy for the waiting journalists. If, as is the case in most countries, the government of Nova Scotia a century ago had assumed full responsibility for higher education, it would long since have supplied the necessary buildings and most of the operating revenue. Instead of this, it is private generosity that has supplied the province with university buildings worth at least $50 million and has built up professorial staffs of high competence. But if the people of Nova Scotia wish higher educational facilities to continue to be available 10 years hence, we shall need another $50 million worth of new buildings and operating grants from the province totaling upwards of $10 million a year. Failing this, our universities are likely to become academic slums, with accommodation and staffs only for one half of those who wish for college training. The tide of new knowledge and the tide of increased population will run together and will drown us all. Kirkconnell expressed appreciation of the work done by Premier Stanfield and his newly formed University Grants Committee, but he went on to make some pointed remarks about priorities. If the grassroots public still feels that paved highways on back roads are more important than the higher education of their young people, how will money be available for this latter urgent task? Kirkconnell's own answer to his question was a dramatic one, no doubt deliberately designed to attract the attention of the media and the government. I quote, "There is an alternative. If the provincial treasurer fails to supply the funds necessary for our expansion and survival, all of the province's universities could agree to a simultaneous increase in tuition fees to $1,500 per student, or 3 times the rate for college students anywhere else in Canada. They would then explain to the tax gatherer through a large-scale press and radio campaign that it was the lack of tax dollars for higher education that compelled these desperate measures. It may be that no other solution lies ahead. One may safely assume that a reference to capital expenditures in the amount of $50 million and an annual operating grant approaching $10 million would be quoted in the press and noted by provincial politicians. The phrase academic slums was probably deliberately chosen to ensure quotation, and if anything could be relied on to orchestrate a chorus of protest from a united choir of students, parents and opposition members, it would be a proposal to triple the cost of university academic fees. The Chronicle Herald for the 5th of May 1964 printed a front-page report of the convocation address at St. Mary's, and on the following day a cartoon by Chambers depicted Premier Stanfield, laden with honours, descending the steps of a Trans-Canada Airlines aircraft. At the foot of the steps stood Watson Kirkconnell in academic regalia, reading from a script on which certain words are clear. And without provincial operating grants of $10 million, our universities are likely to become academic slums. The cartoon caption was, this with Stanfield coming down the steps laden with his honours, "Better be ready to grab him while he's flush with success." Premier Stanfield wrote to me a few weeks ago that he remembers the cartoon, but he doesn't remember what it was he had been honoured with before coming back. It is not possible to provide a precise description of the impact of Kirkconnell's speech at St. Mary's University, but the publicity it received focused attention on the urgent needs of the post-secondary institutions and moved the issue firmly into the political arena. In the case of Acadia, other events took place which directly affected the funding of the university. I refer to the secularization process which began in 1965 and culminated in 1968. The main actors in that particular drama were the Baptist Convention, the Acadia Board of Governors, the Associated Alumni of Acadia, and the provincial government. While the key issue in the dispute was the jurisdiction of the convention over the university, a closely related topic was that of funding. There can be no doubt of the central role played by Kirkconnell in bringing together the university presidents and then gaining the attention of Cabinet. While others moved onto the stage as the passionate and at times bitter drama unfolded, it was largely through Kirkconnell's efforts that the precedent of provincial public money for the universities had been established in Nova Scotia. The benefits which he helped to secure were not only for Acadia. From the beginning of his campaign, he had all the universities in Nova Scotia in mind. To sum up, Kirkconnell's contribution to higher education in Canada may be encapsulated in the statement that he is the father of Canadian multiculturalism, the architect of the Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the leader of the Nova Scotia presidents in their campaign for provincial grants for the universities. His life was long, industrious, and influential in many other ways, but these are the activities I would list as his most important contributions. As I indicated earlier, his Baptist upbringing probably supplied the framework for his thinking about the New Canadians, and accounts, at least in part, for the high regard he had for education. He not only made the most of his own unique talents, but wanted to ensure that others were given the opportunity to fulfill their potential. Almost as a footnote to that, we should note that Kirkconnell was, in the best sense of the word, a reactive person. Wherever he was, he would react to the challenge of any new threat or opportunity and bring his talents to bear on the situation. Not only is this illustrated by the three areas we have discussed, but by his work on behalf of the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Canadian Baptist Federation, the Writers' War Committee, and many other organizations. Some leaders make contributions by imposing their questions and their answers on the constituency. Others operate by responding to questions raised by the situation in which they find themselves. Kirkconnell belongs in the latter group, and higher education in Canada is the richer because of that fact. Many centuries ago, when an ancient Hebrew storyteller looked back on an even more ancient time and considered the facts and legends relating to his ancestors, he made the admiring and succinct comment, "There were giants in the earth in those days." And when a contemporary academic who works in the field of language, or literature, or history, or economics, or botany, or administration, looks back 50 years and sees a predecessor who excelled in all of these areas, he is inclined admiringly, but also somewhat despairingly, to echo the words of Genesis 6:4, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and one of them was named Watson Kirkconnell."